ขอต้อนรับทุกท่านเข้าสู่งานอบรมในหัวข้อ IR Preparation for Roadshow ในวันนี้นะครับซึ่งหลักสูตรวันนี้เนี่ยเป็นหนึ่งใน8หลักสูตรที่ทางตลาดหลักทรัพย์จัดขึ้นเป็นประจำทุกปีนะครับถ้าวันนี้ยังมีเพื่อนที่ยังมาไม่ได้ปีหน้าก็มีอีกเหมือนกันนะครับเรียนเชิญนะครับแล้วก็หลักสูตรนี้เรามุ่งหวังที่จะช่วยให้ท่านมีความเข้าใจเกี่ยวกับความสำคัญของงานRoadshow แล้วก็สามารถทำกิจกรรมRoadshowได้ประสบความสำเร็จมากยิ่งขึ้นนะครับวันนี้เราได้รับเกียรติจากพิธีกรหลายท่านมากก็หวังว่าคงจะเป็นประโยชน์อย่างยิ่งต่อการทำงานท่านต่อไปนะครับในช่วงแรกนะครับผมค่ายขอเรียนเชิญคุณบดินทร์อุณากูลรองผู้จัดการตลาดทรัพย์แห่งประเทศไทยนะครับให้เกียรติกล่าวต้อนรับทุกท่านครับขอเรียนเชิญคุณบดินทร์ครับ
สวัสดีนะครับสวัสดีครับขอมายืนตรงกลางหน่อยนะฮะต้องก่อนอื่นก็ในนามของตลาดหลักทรัพย์แห่งประเทศไทยก็ต้องขอกล่าวขอบคุณนะครับนัก IR ทั้งหลายที่มานั่งกันอยู่ที่นี้นะฮะผมดีใจนะที่มีนักลงทุนสัมพันธ์เยอะขนาดนี้ที่มา attend คลาสนี้นะครับทั้งที่เป็นต้องบอกว่า advanced course ถามว่า advanced ยังไงคุณก็ต้อง advanced นะวันนี้เพราะว่าวิทยากรไม่พูดภาษาไทยสักคนหนึ่งอย่างน้อยก็ต้อง advanced ทางด้านภาษานะครับผมดูสเก็ตแล้วเนี่ยก็ต้องบอกว่าน่าสนใจทีเดียวนะฮะเรามี4 session ด้วยกัน session แรกเนี่ยจะเป็นชาวสิงคโปร์จริงๆเนี่ยเขาก็มาจาก Capital Land นะครับเมื่อกี้ตกลงกันแล้วว่าผมนินทาเขาได้ตอนนี้ช่วงแรกเป็นช่วงภาษาไทยเพราะที่เหลือเป็นภาษาอังกฤษหมดเลยนะฮะถามว่าทำไมสิงคโปร์เนี่ยหลายๆนักลงทุนให้ความสนใจกับสิงคโปร์มากกว่าเมืองไทยซะอีกตอนแรกถือเขาเป็น financial hub ในเอเชียมานั่งฟังกันดูซิว่าเขาขายประเทศเขาขายบริษัทเขาที่สิงคโปร์อย่างไรหรือมองกลับกันได้ด้วยซ้ำไปว่าไอ้เทคนิคที่เขาขายบริษัทเขาที่สิงคโปร์เนี่ยเราอาจจะไปลงทุนกับเขาด้วยได้ไหมนะครับส่วนคนที่สองผู้หญิงหรือผู้ชายฮะ
ผู้หญิงครับ
ผู้หญิงนะครับ
แองเจล่าครับ
อันนี้เนี่ยเป็น global เลยนะครับเมื่อกี้เราดูแค่ประเทศก็คือประเทศสิงคโปร์เพื่อนบ้านก็ดีหรือคู่แข่งของเราก็ดีคนที่สองผู้หญิงแองเจล่าเนี่ย global นะครับอันนี้ก็จะช่วยให้เราออกจากภูมิภาคเราแล้วเพราะต้องบอกว่าประเทศไทยเนี่ยตอนนี้เนี่ยฮอตพอสมควรนะอาจจะดูเหมือนตกต่ำนะครับแต่ว่าอันนี้มันเพราะมันตกต่ำทั้งโลกนะฮะแต่ว่าพอไปคุยกับนักลงทุนจริงๆแล้วเนี่ยต้องบอกว่าเขาให้เวทติ้งสำหรับประเทศไทยเนี่ยเยอะเลยล่ะพอสมควรและขณะนี้ต้องบอกว่าอย่างเช่นวันจันทร์เราก็จะมี dialogue เกิดขึ้นที่นี่เนี่ยพวก exchange ต่างๆในภูมิภาคนี้ก็จะมานั่งคุยกันถามว่าทำอย่างไรให้ทั้ง region เนี่ยโตขึ้นมาได้แทนที่จะเป็นประเทศเล็กๆหลายๆประเทศเราอาจจะทำเป็น region ไหมอาจจะไปถึง regional index ไหมนะครับอันนั้นไม่ว่ากันเดี๋ยวไว้คุยกันทีหลังนะครับแต่ก็เป็นสิ่งที่น่าสนใจที่จะต้องนั่งดูว่าทางด้าน global investor เนี่ยเขาคิดอย่างไรแล้วถ้าเขาถามคุณเขาจะถามอะไรบ้างนะฮะส่วนคนอีกคนหนึ่ง
คุณจัสตินครับ
ซึ่งจะพูดอันนี้เป็น
เรื่องของ investor targeting strategy
ใช่ไหมนะฮะอันนี้เนี่ยจะเป็นวิชาการหน่อยว่าเราควรจะไปหาใครนะครับไม่ใช่ขณะนี้นี่ก็คือว่า IR เรากำลังรอให้เขาเดินมาหาแล้วเราก็เหมือนรับแขกแล้วเราก็บอกเขาว่ายังไงตอนนี้ทาง IR จะต้อง proactive แล้วถ้าเกิดคุณโดนนายคุณสั่งแล้วก็บอกว่าเฮ้ยไปช่วยขายหน่อยยูไปขายใครมันเหมือนทำ marketing กับ 4Ps ยูจะต้องไปขายใครขายอย่างไรดีอันเนี้ยนะคุณดัสตินจะช่วยส่วนภาคสุดท้ายนี่กลับมา Head of IR ของเราใช่ไหมคุณอ้นใช่ไหมนะครับ BTS อันเนี้ยจะมาบอกบริบทของไทยกลับมาสรุปว่าชมรม IR เนี่ยคิดยังไงกับเรื่องนี้ แล้วก็จะ move IR ไปในทิศทางไหนต่อไปนะครับทั้งหมดนี้ก็เป็นส่วนหนึ่งในการที่ตลาดหลักทรัพย์ต้องการที่จะพัฒนาตลาดทุนนะฮะให้พวกเราเนี่ยมีสินค้าที่มีคุณภาพที่ดีที่สุดแล้วต้องบอกพวกคุณเนี่ยเป็นบุคลากรที่สำคัญนะเพราะพวกคุณเป็นด่านหน้าหรืออาจจะด่านเดียวด้วยซ้ำไปในการที่นักลงทุนทั้งหลายเนี่ยจะมาให้ความสนใจบริษัทคุณหรือตลาดหุ้นไทยคือถ้าเขาฟังคุณแล้วเขาฟังไม่รู้เรื่องหรือเขาไม่ปิ๊งนะเขาก็จบเลยมันอาจจะไม่ถึง CEO คุณได้ซ้ำไปเพราะฉะนั้นถ้าเกิดมีอะไรมีคำถามอะไรนะฮะกรุณาถามได้เลยเราจัดเซสชั่นพวกนี้ค่อนข้างจะบ่อยนะไม่ใช่ครั้งนี้ครั้งเดียวอยากจะให้มาเทนกับทุกคอร์สเลยด้วยซ้ำไปที่ทางตลาดหลักทรัพย์มีนะฮะจะได้มี exposure หลายๆด้านหลายๆคนว่า IR เนี่ยในธุรกิจเนี้ยในวงการเนี้ยเขาคิดยังไงขณะนี้ที่บอกเป็น advance เพราะว่าแทนที่จะฟังจากทางไทยอย่างเดียวฟังจากกลต.ฟังจากตลาดหลักทรัพย์ลองมาคิดซิพวกฝรั่งเนี่ยไม่ว่าจะหัวดำหัวแดงเนี่ยคิดยังไงโอเคนะครับก็ถึงเวลาแล้วละที่จะเริ่มคลาสขอบคุณมากครับ
ขอบคุณมากครับ So now we come to the main part of today's event. The first session will be the presentation on the capital market landscape and IR practice in Singapore. First, I must say that I'm very much honored to have Mr. Wu as our guest speaker today. Mr. Wu has more than 19 years of stockbroking experiences, and he's now a senior vice president for investor relations of CapitaLand. During his work with CapitaLand, he has earned so many Best IRO awards from IR Magazine. Apart from that, he is also the president of IR Professionals Association Singapore. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Wu.
Should I use this one?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, SCT, for inviting me to be one of the speakers. I'm very glad to be here and really speaking my capacity as president of the IRPAS. I will have a couple of slides to introduce and give you more details of what IRPAS, but in short, we are the Investor Relations Association of Singapore. We are an association of professionals, IRO, that we're trying to raise the level of best practice and professionalism in Singapore. And we were formed in 2006, and we're still growing. But so here we are. So I'm speaking here today as also based on the introduction just now. Very much like yourself, as a practitioner, I'm also the investor relations officer. I head the IR department in CapitaLand. I'm not sure whether you have heard of CapitaLand, but CapitaLand is a real estate developer, one of the largest in Asia, listed only in Singapore. We have four main business: residential business, shopping malls. We have service residents, and we have a couple of our service residents in Bangkok, and under the brands of Escort, Saturn, a couple of Citadines spread out all over in Bangkok. And then we also have our couple of big, large projects, what we call the Raffles City. Yeah. So today, I think I was asked to speak on the topic of to introduce to you a little bit on the capital markets in Singapore, and then later on, I think about practices of IR in Singapore. So some of the slides which are used for this capital landscape is actually data gathered from the SGX, and if you have any questions later on, in fact, one of the senior vice president of the SGX will be coming up next month. So I've left my cards at the registration table. Just feel free to pick it up. Both my cards, drop me the email, and we're happy to refer you to the SVP. His name is Simon Lim, when he comes up to Bangkok next month. So, introductory slide, Singapore. Perhaps I could ask through a show of hands, how many of you have been to Singapore? Can I have a show of hands? Okay, about half. Well, for those of you who have not been to Singapore, let me be an ambassador of Singapore. On behalf of Singapore, we warmly welcome you in about 2 weeks' time. We're actually holding the Southeast Asian Games in Singapore after an absence of 27 years, so it's still not too late. Anyway, nowadays, lots of budget airlines exist, so it's very easy to get a ticket. There are many flights down to Singapore. Come down to Singapore, spend a weekend or spend a couple of days and support your Thai national team. So, I think you have seen some of these slides. A bit of marketing for Singapore, but we are basically an international financial center. I mean, people always mention New York, London, Hong Kong. I suppose Singapore is right up there among the top 5. So our capital market, I think, basically very much centered around the Singapore Stock Exchange. Unlike the SCT, the SGX obviously is an exchange, but it not only has a share trading equity market, it also has a very vibrant commodity markets. A lot of derivatives are listed in Singapore and traded in Singapore. But the SGX itself is actually a listed company, so you can so while they are a listed exchange, they also have a regulatory role over the listed companies which they govern. But when it comes to more sensitive issues, we have a Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is a super body that actually regulates through our rules and regulations. So you can see that SGX basically is an international market. We have about 40% of our listed companies from outside Singapore, and there's actually a very large listing of foreign companies who actually list their bonds in Singapore. So I think for some of you, if you're thinking of issuing bonds, I think do consider the SGX actually has a lot of fixed income instruments listed. This is just a geographical spread of the exchange. As you can see, we have about 760 odd listed companies, total market cap of 752 million. So 62% of that is Singapore domiciled company, but we actually have quite a lot of non-Singapore owned companies listed on exchange as well. Which about actually you can see is China. In fact, the exchange has been very instrumental in trying to attract Chinese companies to list in Singapore. And in fact, in a couple of months' time, we actually will be setting up, SGX itself is setting up an office in Shanghai to try and entice more Chinese companies to list in Singapore. This is the various so-called industry groups, if you want to group them. So you can see it's also quite well diversified. Industrial companies, consumer companies, financial companies, and then we have IT, materials. The telecoms is small, but the largest listed company is obviously Singtel, which actually owns Advanced Info System here, as you know, and their market cap is about 40 billion Sing dollars. So they are one of the largest market cap company. And these are the sectors, as I said. So these figures are current as of end of March this year. So you can see, for some of you, you may find your own company, how it compares with perhaps the current PE, which is in Singapore trading within those sectors. So as I said earlier, we not only have equities on the SGX, there's fixed income, there's a lot of derivatives as well. The SGX itself has actually listed a lot of what we call exchange traded funds as well. These are either pegged to index or to different indices. And it's actually one of the only exchange outside China where we actually offer a future contract based on the 50 largest Chinese company. And then there's on the commodity side, there's rubber, there's fuel oil. And I think they have also tied up with Chicago Board of Trade, where we trade some of the instruments like coal, iron ore, energy. And there are also a couple of big Chinese companies and US companies that has actually got ADRs, American Depository Receipts, and these are also listed and traded in Singapore during the Asian time zone. Yeah, I think so. To summarize, it's quite a big pool of money actually being managed out of Singapore. You can see the figure there is about $2.4 trillion under management in Singapore. And in Singapore, I think you're able to access a very global investor base, which not only includes retail investors from Singapore, but certainly from China, India, and rest of Southeast Asia. So I think it's a very good marketplace where you can actually tap the market. There is a very market-oriented regulatory framework, and the cost of trading actually is very competitive. I think the other sector which is very interesting, is quite unique to the XGX, is that we actually pioneered the REIT. The REIT is a real estate investment trust. That was happened in 2002, and in fact CapitaLand's pioneered the first REIT called CapitaLand Mall Trust. So outside Japan, actually Singapore has a very large REIT market. And if you're familiar with REITs, REITs are basically a collective scheme where you allow the unit holders to own real estate with good liquidity. So not many people can buy a building or not buy a hotel. But I think if you have a REIT and then you get other shareholders, so basically you have part ownership of the asset. And yet it is particularly suitable because it is actually deemed to be a retirement product. So in Singapore, for instance, the distribution, which is equivalent to the dividend that you receive when you own a unit of the REIT, is actually tax-free. So it becomes very attractive. You don't have to do anything, you're not taxed at all. And it allows you to have ownership. And so REITs are particularly good instruments to hold what we call stabilized income-producing assets. So they tend to, obviously there is some volatility because they are listed in the market, but basically they give you a much higher yield than perhaps equities would do. Because it's actually based on very stabilized, income-producing assets. It may be an office building, it may be a shopping mall that collects rent, or it could be a service apartment that also collects revenue. Yeah, I mentioned about the pool of money being managed out of Singapore, $2.4 trillion. That's quite sizable, based on estimate. So about 1.4 trillion of that is in forms held by institution. We got a lot of private wealth management offices as well. A lot of Swiss private banks actually have set up operations in Singapore, in addition to the Singapore ones. So that's about 500 billion of pool of money. And of course, we got a couple of our own sovereign wealth fund. I think particularly we've heard of Temasek Holdings, which is actually owned by the Ministry of Finance, and Government Investment Corporation of Singapore, GIC. Those are the two SWF. So I think look at the universe of professionals, almost about 3,000. We got about 4,000 registered funds and about 200 fund management company. I think the last point is quite interesting. You can see that it's been forecast that by the year 2030, in fact, Singapore could actually overtake London to be the second largest global asset management hub by the year 2018, just behind New York. This, I think, is a reflection of some of the equity and the debt that has been raised in the market in last year, about 170 billion, as you can see. So as I mentioned, the bulk of that actually is fixed income instruments, bonds. The equities market has been a bit patchy last year. There were not many IPOs because of the volatility, and also, despite all the QE, there was always concern that when is interest rates going to rise, and so I think that has affected the sentiment for the equity market particularly. So you can see, there are sizable pool of capital down in Singapore. Besides your global investors, these are some of the big foreign-owned institutions that's got operations down in Singapore. I think some of you will be familiar with the names. They could well be shareholders in your company. If they are not, I think certainly these are some of the good names that you want to target at, because most of them actually are long-only funds, i.e. They're looking to invest in companies with very good fundamentals, with a sustainable business model, and they will be very patient capital, and it's good to have them on board on your share register. Then of course, as I said, we have a big pool of Chinese investors as well, and a lot of them actually has got private accounts in Singapore. In Singapore, we have what we call a central depository system. So you have to set up an account, and all your shares actually, because Singapore is scriptless, is all through book entry. So based on our records, we have about 33,000 Chinese who's got an individual account with our central depository. And on top of that, we got about 14,000 Indian citizens as well. So that's a sizable pool. This is a listing of some of our recent IPO. Yeah, as I said, you can see that the REITs, I think, were one of the bigger ones. This is SPH REIT is actually part of the Singapore Press Holding. It's actually the largest media company in Singapore. Publishes on our daily newspaper, and also own a stake in one of our television channels. So a lot of this, couple of the active IPOs last year were actually REITs. They've done quite well. I think the other thing, if you're not aware, is that there's also what we call an Asian connection. So through the brokerages in Singapore, in fact, we can actually trade with companies listed on SET, and correspondingly, I think you can contact one of the Thai brokers, and they can actually trade in stocks listed on SGX or in Malaysia, on Bursa Malaysia, Indonesia. So on the SGX itself, actually we got three companies that's actually listed. The largest of which is Thai Beverage. I'm quite sure all you know Thai Beverage, Chang Beer. And of course, I think the other one is TAC, but I think TAC is not very actively traded. Okay, so I think that sort of wraps up my introduction about the capital market in Singapore. As I said, if you want to know more, the person from the SGX will be making a trip up, particularly if you think you're interested in knowing more about how you can tap the bond market. Drop me a line. I'm happy to help you to arrange a meeting when it's in Bangkok. So I thought I'll start off before I talk about practices, give you a textbook definition of investor relations. This is actually taken from the examination text from the IR Society in the UK, of which I think some of you may be familiar, because I gathered since last year, the SET has also been organizing this exam called the International Certificate in IR, which we also introduced in Singapore last year. And we have about, so far, 40 odd people who successfully passed the exam, and we're actually holding our exam a batch of exam next week. We've got about 20 people signing up. So, what is IR? I think the official definition based on the IR Society is to develop long-term relationships with our investors with an emphasis on forging and sustaining open and consistent communication channels with our various stakeholders. I think this is all quite familiar stuff to you as practicing IROs. I won't delve too much into that, but basically, we need to broaden our base of long-term investors, how to maximize shareholder value and reduce the cost of capital to the corporation, building a corporate brand, and of course, with the competition for capital being so keen, how do you actually get the coverage and the attention of both not only the sell side analysts, the buy side, but also getting the media attention as well. I think these are just some of the building blocks of IR. It's not so much about share price appreciation as you know, but it's really trying to help the company to attain its fair valuation. So I think it's not trying to make sure that your share price always outperform, because you know market conditions are difficult. As you know, nobody can control Mr. Market. But I think if your fundamentals are in place and you have built up a loyal base of stakeholders who believe in your business model, who understand your competitive advantage, then I think you know it's a matter of patience, and sometimes you have to ride out the volatility. And really, I think being a listed company gives you the flexibility at some stage when you need to grow the company. You need to come back to your shareholders for further equity. So I think that's important. And of course, besides equity, you can also issue different hybrid instruments, such as corporate bonds, particularly to your domestic institutions. And then you can also do convertible bonds. If your share price is trading at a nice premium, you may want to tap the CB market. It's another very specific pool of money where they like to buy these CBs, collect a higher coupon than perhaps your yield, and yet have the option that at some stage, if your share price perform, they can then actually convert into equity. So I think how do you attain some of those objectives? I suppose that's what's the job of the IRO so interesting. Not only maintaining your stable base of shareholders, deepening your relationship with them, but really participating in brokers' conferences, doing non-deal roadshows to try and seek out new shareholders, improve the visibility of the company, and of course, more importantly, I think keeping a very high standard of corporate disclosure, which I think will differentiate one company that is well-owned versus a company that perhaps is neglected by the market. So I think various feedback channels. One obviously is to the internal dynamics of your own board, your senior management. If you're a large conglomerate, you may have divisional managers or and then you may have different specific business unit, what we call SBU. So I think this is important where the IRO can actually provide the eyes and ears to the board, to senior management, through giving them constant feedback, either post-meeting or through your dialogue with analysts. You can do it in many ways, but for instance, in CapitaLand, we have a quarterly board paper that I circulate to the board. And on top of that, I think we do hold a lot of feedback session as well. I think it's nowadays what differentiates one successful non-deal roadshow from another is that basically you have to ask the brokerage house that organize the thing to give you the feedback. That's very important. Because otherwise, almost most of the big brokerage houses can organize roadshow. They all speak to the same clients. What differentiates one good broker from another is ability to give you the sort of feedback. You take away and then you go back and distill it and then present it to management. And perhaps that may change, not drastically, help you to tweak the way you tell your story. And sometimes it is, you'll be surprised that management may take it on a board and actually change the strategy. So I think these are the constituents of the feedback loop, as I said. For financial media, I think it's important that you work very closely with your company corporate communications, if you have such a department. Or sometimes I know in some of the mid-cap companies, the same IRO actually maybe wear two hats. Not only does he deal with the investors, he also deal with the media as well. And on the external side, I think these are some of the so-called building blocks. That what are the external parties after earnings guidance, a bit tricky. CapitaLand itself actually, as a norm, we don't actually provide earnings guidance because being real estate is very hard to predict. You never know when you launch a residential project how your sales may go. So we tend not to give earnings guidance. So But I think in certain industries where there's a higher level of predictability, you can do that. So for instance, I was reading yesterday's commentary from Singtel, and they just delivered their results, the quarterly results, and the CEO guided, in fact, expectations for next year. It's not a specific number, but normally they give you a range of single-digit improvement or mid-single-digit, somewhere like that, along those lines. Value drivers, I think that's important. Access to management, that's another, always cited as a very important factor when how investors rate investor relations in a company. I think more importantly, I think it's the transparency and trust, which I think you need to inculcate in your company to attract the right type of investors.